Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Sharing Coalition November event. Please continue to join us each month as we dive into important environmental issues in our town. Of course, keep an eye on the SSC newsletter and website for upcoming events. Let's thank the primary organizer of tonight's forum, Frank Shaw, as well as our organizer and moderators and speakers. We have distinguished moderator here tonight and distinguished speakers as well. And we thank Sharon Community TV and Hetty for being here to record it. The purpose of tonight's panel is to help voters understand the differences between continuing to source Sharon's water from municipal wells versus switching to MWRA water in terms of cost, health, and the environment. Our moderator this evening is Veronica Wiseman, a familiar face to many of you. Veronica is an actor and speech language pathologist who settled in Sharon with her husband Howard in 1998. Veronica is president of the board of directors of Sharon Community TV, chair of the Sharon Scouts Trust, and has served on the Sharon School Committee for over a decade. I will turn it over to Veronica, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for inviting me and for the opportunity to moderate this evening's event. As Cheryl mentioned, the town of Sharon is confronting a critical issue. Where should our drinking water come from? Sharon's municipal wells or the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, Quabbin and Wachusett reservoirs. Problems with Sharon's municipal wells have been a concern for some time, and by now many have seen the warrant for our special town meeting on November 30th. The Select Board and the Finance Committee both recommend the approval of Article 1, which would authorize the town to borrow additional funds to shore up our town wells. But some in our community think it's time to join the MWRA and get our water from the Quabbin and Wachusett reservoirs. They're concerned that choosing the multi-million-dollar filtration facility would presumably exhaust the borrower power of the water department for many years and thus preempt the MWRA option for the foreseeable future. I want to say in all honesty that I came to this topic completely not knowing anything about it. So I come as a completely open to learning tonight, along with everyone else, what these choices are. And I'm grateful for Sustainable Sharon to put this on so that we can all learn together as a community. First, I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists. First, Stephen Estes Smargiassi. Stephen is the Director of Planning and Sustainability for the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. We're going to call that the MWRA tonight. During his 30 years at the MWRA, Stephen has worked on issues like promoting water conservation, decreasing lead levels in drinking water, and improving hurricane preparation. Ian Cook is the longtime executive director of the nonprofit Neponset River Watershed Association, which aims to clean up and protect the Neponset River, its tributaries, and surrounding watershed lands in Sharon and the 13 other communities that make up the watershed. Ian has helped lead a variety of initiatives in Sharon and neighboring communities to encourage water conservation, reduce water pollution, restore habitats for native fish and wildlife, and help make communities more resilient to climate change. Ira Miller is a member of Sharon's Finance Committee. An active participant in local and state affairs, Ira has served on the Sharon Finance Committee for more than 20 years, with service on both the Capital Outlay and Priorities Committees, as well as liaison to the schools, library, police, and select board. He's also a board member of both Sharon TV and Friends of the Sharon Council on Aging. And finally, Mr. David Hearn has been a member of Sharon's Water Management Advisory Committee, serving the town of Sharon for more than 15 years. Prior to that, he was a member of the Finance Committee for 5 years, also served on numerous study and design review committees for both the school department and the Board of Selectmen. He has now lived in Sharon with his family for over 20 years. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. The questions we have been submitted to us by the folks at Sustainable Sharon, and we gave them ahead of time to our panelists with some recommendation as to who might answer the questions. But as I said, I'll pose questions to particular panelists, but if anybody does have anything to add, please feel free to do so. The first question is for you, Stephen, and that is, how is the water quality of surface water from MWRA reservoirs different from that of groundwater from Sharon wells, especially in terms of hardness and contaminants such as PFAS, nitrates, sodium, iron, and manganese?
So that's a fairly broad question. And I will say for anyone who's interested in any more details on a number of my answers, that our webpage has a very large amount of water quality and water quantity related data that folks can look for. So let me just pick through a couple of those things. We have a very soft water. So compared to most groundwaters, very soft. That means you get better shampoo ladder. You don't need a water softener. And you use less soap in your dishwasher, less likely to etch your glasses. That's an aesthetic concern, maybe a little bit of some economic concern if you need a water softener. What we're mostly concerned about are things which affect our health. So when you look at things like nitrates or almost any of the contaminants of concern, our very well protected water supplies have very low levels. Let me tick through a couple of the ones that you pointed out. Sodium, we're about 8 milligrams per glass of water, so about 30, 32, 36, varies a little from year to year, milligrams per liter. Considered low from a food perspective, but a little bit above a guidance value of 20. Almost all groundwaters in the state are higher than that. I think for the thing that people are most interested in these days is PFAS, the per and polyfluorinated alkali substances. Our sources have very low levels. We do test for it regularly. The data is up on our website. We do believe in transparency. And what we find is that for most of them, we don't detect them at all. For a small number of the large number of compounds that we do test for, we see trace amounts. Trace means that it's present, but at levels that are too low to be quantified. So you can think of it as, I can see it, I'm pretty sure it's there, but I can't tell you how much is there. But what we can say is it's below 2 parts per trillion, because that's the required reporting level, or the level at which we would be able to quantify the number. So less than 2 parts per trillion for all the PFAS that we've regularly tested for. If you go on our website, you can also compare not only our data to the DEP standards for PFAS. They say PFAS 6 needs to be less than 20 parts per trillion, but also against the proposed EPA standards that we do expect to see out in the next few weeks or a month or so, perhaps right after the first of the year. We'll see a final rule, but we do have the information from the draft rule up on our website. I don't know if there were other details. Iron and manganese, relatively low. You don't typically see staining. In some of our communities, the old cast iron pipes can contribute iron, but there's very low levels of iron and manganese in our source water. And nitrates, nitrites, typically very low levels, basically atmospheric deposition over the reservoirs. As I said, very well protected, mostly forest and trees and wetlands out in central Mass, about 65 miles west of Boston. I'll stop there, and maybe there can be more questions later.
Well, thank you, Stephen. That was a very comprehensive answer. We appreciate that. Next, I'm going to turn to David Hearn. David, can you explain that there were high levels of PFAS 6 discovered in Sharon's biggest well, approximately 100 parts per PPT, which is 5 times higher than the maximum contaminant level for PFAS specified by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. First, could you explain to the community here, where did the PFAS come from, and how do contaminants in a densely populated community like Sharon reach the groundwater aquifers?
So first of all, I'm not a water expert per se. I serve on the advisory committee. But what energy has been put into sourcing the PFAS contamination at well 4 may have isolated an auto body facility that used to be located in the parking lot of the train station at the center of town. Excuse me. There is a monitoring well, a well water level monitoring well in between that location and well number 4. And that monitoring well had a high spike as well. So it's possible that there's been a migration of contamination that was site specific from that location towards well number 4. If that was the only source of PFAS in town, life wouldn't be so complicated. We have other wells that are obviously impacted by PFAS that have not been able to be affected by that specific auto body facility. So the general assumption is, and I think, you know, Ian could speak to this and Steve as well. The general assumption is for most communities in Eastern Massachusetts and across the United States for that matter, that well water is being polluted by, you know, everyday usage of septic systems and, you know, people flushing toilets, essentially. If that makes, you know, it's everywhere. And
Sure.
if I could just take one follow-up to Stephen's opening as well, the fact that it's everywhere, now we're finding it in freshwater fish, we're finding it in rainwater. So Steve mentioned that right now, I believe he said Quabbin is under the 2 parts per trillion. I'm curious to know if it's in rainwater, what is MWRA's plan to deal with it once they see it spike above that 2 parts per trillion? I don't know if that's something we want to go back to later, but I think it'd be interesting for people to hear MWRA's planning for PFAS.
Great question. I would say in the medium term, we do not expect to see a substantial change in the levels. What we're seeing for the primary constituents that many people see, PFOA and PFOS, is that the occurrence around in the environment or entering the environment seems to be going down. If you are seeing things in atmospheric deposition, it's probably because they're coming out of smokestacks somewhere. And we do expect that as EPA issues more controls, that will not be a larger contributor, but a stable or smaller contributor. So I would say we look closely at the data. We don't currently anticipate in our capital planning. We do a 10-year capital budget. We do 20 to 40-year long-term master plans. And our current master plan doesn't anticipate that we are going to need to add treatment for PFAS over the life cycle of that, given what we know today. It's important to be humble as you think about environmental issues because we don't know what's around the bend. But I guess I would say the way in which I like to think about this is, given the quality of our source waters, the highly protected reservoirs, that when we have a problem, if we have a problem, it's going to be a much bigger problem everywhere else. So if our levels are going up to the point where we take notice of it, it means that almost everybody else in the world is going to be having a more serious issue. So I don't like to be sanguine about it, but I think we've been blessed by the foresight of the folks before us and investments we've made in watershed protection to reduce the odds that there'll be a substantial change in 10, 15, 20 years.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'm going to just step in here for a second as, again, a novice community member who's hearing this sort of for the first time. So far, what I'm understanding is that the water coming from the reservoirs, the Quabbin and Wachusett, right now is effectively cleaner than the water that we have in Sharon. And in Sharon, our challenge is to figure out ways to make sure that we are treating our water so that it is safe and useful for our community, right? So right now it feels like so far what I've learned is those are the major differences for now. That's our challenge, right? We've got this opportunity potentially either now or down the road to look at a source outside of town for water, which would potentially be cleaner. And the challenge is the question that we're facing now to address the issue of cleaning the water we have and investing in the current systems we have. So far, that's where I'm at as a listener and a community member. So of course, we want to talk about costs to the town for all of these things. So the next question I have on the list is the average water bill for MWRA users, right? According to the website, community assessments, which are bills, right, typically represent about 45% of the amount that communities bill their customers. However, based on the report the Water Department submitted to the Finance Committee, the cost of MWRA water is only 18% of the total budget. And that was kind of a question that was going to be addressed to either David or Ira. And I'm not sure which of you two gents want to touch that one, but could one of you help us out there with some info?
I know David did an analysis, so I'll let him speak to that. But before we leave the last question, I just don't want to leave the impression with the people in Sharon that they have unsafe water, that they're drinking unsafe water. Our water is very safe to drink because it is treated, and we've been very active in making sure that the water is safe. So we don't want to leave the impression with people that the water that is going into people's homes is not safe. And David, I'll let you handle the analysis of the cost of that water. I'm not sure where the 18% comes from. Maybe
yeah, I had trouble figuring out exactly what the 18% figure represented as well. My best guess is what that question is looking for, referring to, is the fact that if we join MWRA and we were to supplement our current annual volume of usage, paying the $4.53 per thousand fee for water that the MWRA is currently charging, that would add about $1.9 million to our annual operating budget of the water department. If you take a water department budget expected next year of approximately 6.4 million, something like that, if I'm remembering that, you add 2 million to that, that 1.9 million becomes something on the order of 20% of the future budget of the town, of the, I'm sorry, not the budget of the town, of the operating budget of the water department. And the important thing there is for people to understand that even if we do join MWRA, the Sharon Water Department doesn't disappear, nor does its annual operating budget. That $6.4 million is largely spent distributing water, maintaining the infrastructure to distribute water to people's homes, as well as billing and whatnot. But all of those operations would have to continue. Basically, what we're doing is replacing, our current wells where we extract water from the ground with a pipe from MWRA, and we extract water from that pipe. So again, the 6.4 million doesn't disappear, and that's the the current valuation, but that doesn't disappear, and we add that 1.9 million of additional cost to purchase the water from the MWRA. So I think that's what that question was getting to.
Thank you, David. That helps. And Ira, I appreciate the caveat about the safety of our water. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn back to you, Steve, to talk a little bit about the opportunity to join the MWRA and whether or not this option will be one that is well into our future, right? And how many towns typically are thinking about joining, and is there a limit on the number of towns? Can you speak to those issues?
Yeah, I could try and take a broader view of that and then come down to the more detail. So the way in which water suppliers think about, particularly surface water suppliers, think about the capacity of a system is a term we call safe yield. What that represents is the ability of the water system to supply water year in, year out, day in, day out, high demand days, low demand days, and through the period of the biggest drought that you've planned for. So for our region, far-thinking folks plan for a drought that's at least as severe as the drought of the 1960s. That was a 5 or 6 year long drought, substantially reduced yield of everybody's supplies, both groundwater and surface water. So when we think about our system, we can say that we could supply during a drought as severe as the 1960s, about 300 million gallons per day, average over the year, more in the summer, less in the winter, but an average over the year of 300 million gallons per day. Compared to that, you want to know how much are we currently withdrawing from the system. Obviously, you want to withdraw less from the system than your safe yield. If you withdraw more, the next time you have a drought, you're in trouble. So currently, our demand on the system is about 200 million gallons per day. So we have a space between our safe yield and our current demand of about 100 million gallons per day. Now, we wouldn't want to necessarily say all of that's available for new communities. We do reserve capacity for the folks who are currently in the system. Obviously, they would have sort of, if you will, first dibs on the water. Want to make sure that those we've already committed to and anyone we commit to in the future, that we're able to supply them over the long haul. So we look out for long-term population and employment and water use projections to figure out what that might look like. We also supply some communities only partially. That means that they buy some of their water from us and some of them comes from local supplies. In those cases, we make an allowance for those communities to buy more water from us in a drought, or that occasionally they may take their supplies offline for maintenance, for pollution, for some reason that they may be no longer taking supply out of their local supplies and take more from us. All of that said, we would have probably about 50 million, I think we said 51 million gallons available for new customers. So that's one way to think about it. So yes, there is capacity available for us to serve additional customers. And we have been going through a series of studies, partly funded by the legislature, to look at whether there are opportunities for communities to come to the MWRA, either because they have had polluted sources and look for our cleaner water versus having to treat their other water, or for other economic reasons, economic development and so on. So we're looking at that around the region. The last thing I'd say about that is there is, I hate to say a limited time offer, but our board of directors and our advisory board reviewed some of our policies for what we call system expansion a couple of years back, and basically came up with the idea that what we used to have is a entrance fee. That entrance fee, you could think of it as joining the partnership, buying into the paid off assets of the system. That had become a stumbling block for communities to think about joining the MWRA, as they were needing either additional supply or to deal with a polluted well. And our board said, let's do a 5-year moratorium, 5-year waiver of that entrance fee. And during that time, if a community were to go through the process of joining the system, they could join without paying the entrance fee. Still need to build whatever you need to do to connect to the system, still need to buy the water, pay for the water you do use once you join, but not having that entrance fee. So we're a couple of years, a little bit under 2 years into that process. And so folks who are thinking about joining, it seems advantageous to look at it now from a financial perspective, but I wouldn't say the door would be closed for capacity reasons beyond that. We don't anticipate that we'll sell all the water capacity we have in the short term. So I wouldn't say the door would be closed, but if the community is considering spending money on a treatment plant today or joining the MWRA, now is a good time to think about that.
That's very helpful. And before we leave off this topic, does it feel like more towns are joining now due to similar concerns with contamination in local water, Steve?
I would say we have a lot of folks who are talking to us because they're in very much the same position that Sharon is. They have, with the change in regulations for PFAS, and I think overall concern for a number of, maybe contaminants that we don't know yet coming down the road, a number of communities in the Metro West region, south of Boston on the South Shore, and a few north are exploring that option. I would say we have a few who are more serious, and a number who are sort of just at that, explore their options, talk to us, see what the facts are, just as you're doing tonight.
Great. And Steve, another couple questions for you.
By the way, for the Metro West, north of the system and south of the system are all up on our website. If you go on, I think if you go to the website and look for system expansion in the search box, you'll get to those reports. It's a lot of good detail there.
Thank you. I see David Hearn has his hand raised. David, go ahead.
Thank you. So a question for Steve as a follow-up to that. So as you expand your system and you're essentially reaching out to communities that geographically are further from the center of Boston or whatever, but we are further from your hard infrastructure. Maybe not if you're climbing out, the Mass Pike Metro West area. But I'm curious to know what, if any, planning MWRA has done to provide the necessary infrastructure to reach communities that are further out on the periphery? Is that something you're planning? Is that something you're concerned about?
Good question. I mean, so the historical approach has been that as a new community joined, they provided the I'll call sort of that initial connection. So if you go back over many, many years, many communities joined by that way. They helped finance a portion of infrastructure that connected to the system. So typically we would call that the connection cost. Having said that, we do look at kind of regional planning issues and try and think about, is there a way in which if there are several communities that are interested, we and they can work together to figure out what the most cost-effective infrastructure would look like. That's part of the conversation that's occurring in the Metro West area. Part of the information is sort of on our website for those system expansion studies. The hard part in all of that is getting everybody lined up, at the same time, with in the same direction, if you will, to make decisions, and then figuring out, the appropriate routing. So what I would say is once a community's in the system, we consider our obligation to make sure that we're able to provide them a reliable supply. So we do look at how do we provide, alternate pathways, redundancy, emergency supply, whatever's necessary to make sure that a community that's buying our water can rely on that for the long haul. That's not an exact answer to your question. It's probably about as far as I can go without having a map in front of us and talking to surrounding communities.
I see Ian Cook has his hand up. Ian, go ahead.
I was just going to add maybe a clarifying question for Steve. My impression is that there is existing sort of piping infrastructure for the most part in place that would support Sharon being able to join the MWRA. Is that true?
So as you get further away from the core, you're further away from our big pipe infrastructure. So one of the things we do look at is if a community is looking to join us is, do we have the capacity to move water to wherever they would want to take that supply off? So we have hydraulic modeling experts on our team, and we would look at, all right, if this community wants to take water from that location, do we have the ability to move water towards that location? If a community is wheeling water, that would mean, for instance, taking water through another community system. We would work with the community that's buying water, the community that's wheeling the water in our system, and make sure that there's enough capacity to move the water, if you will, all the way from the reservoir to the ultimate customer. We do want to make sure that the hydraulic capacity is there. Makes no sense to be a member of the system if we can't get the quantity and pressure of water that's necessary to supply the ultimate resident. So that's a cooperative planning effort at that point between all the parties.
Thank you, Steve. Ian, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Great.
Could I follow up with an addition to that?
Sure.
So if I could give you a hypothetical, Steve, because I'd really like to try to nail this down, not to put you in a difficult position at all, but let's take the town of Foxborough as an example. They're not a member of yours. They're a budding neighbor of ours. But let's just say that we needed to go through the town of Foxborough with a pipe to connect to your system. With the MWRA, and we wanted to wheel the water rather than put in a dedicated pipe through that town. We wanted to rely on the town of Foxborough to use their infrastructure to supply the town of Sharon with water. Would the MWRA get involved in any way as an oversight body or a management body to control the agreement between Sharon and Foxborough so Sharon could be secure in their water future? Or no, we're just going to give the water to Foxborough. Whatever Sharon and Foxborough do is between them. How does the MWRA look at that? Does that make sense as a question?
Excellent question. And the way in which we think about that is we wouldn't we would not get you or us in a situation where there wasn't appropriate intermunicipal arrangements. So typically through the overall approval process, you would end up having to have letters between the appropriate back and forth in an intermunicipal agreement that specified how the water was going to be transferred through that community. We've seen this recently in Southborough and Ashland, where Ashland is wheeling water through Southborough. They have an intermunicipal agreement that specifies how the metering is going to work, how the charges are going to work, what improvements the two towns cooperated on. In that case, they needed to add some capacity to a pump station, and they shared in the costs. Some portion of that, as I understand it, was for the needs of Southborough, and some of it was for the expansion in order to serve Ashland. And we are one of the parties, if you will, of those sort of multiple agreements. And we would not be in a situation where we were approving the final agreement with the town unless those other intermunicipal arrangements had already been made. Wouldn't make any sense for us to be in a situation where we were theoretically prepared to sell water to Ashland and Southborough wasn't prepared to move it across their system for the long haul.
Ira, I saw you had your hand up before. Do you have something?
Thank you. Yes. Again, there's a lot of information. We did a lot of research into this article when it was put on the agenda for the special town meeting. And one of the reasons was you talk about the opportunity. We had some grant opportunities, which is actually lowering the cost to build our own water treatment plant. And this is all spelled out in the recommendation that the Finance Committee has made. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but the article that's proposed for the special town meeting, and the reason for a special town meeting is the somewhat urgency to make a decision to move this project forward. We've already committed as a town meeting, in a prior town meeting, $15 million, I think $15.8 million of borrowing for the water treatment project. And again, this has been studied for a long time once the PFAS issue came about. We had a well that supplied a lot of the water to most of our system, which was well 4. That was identified and actually had to be shut down. And what the town did was purchase a temporary treatment facility. And that was about 3.5 years ago, I believe. And we found that to correct the problem.
I'm just watching this meeting about whether we should connect to MWRA or not.
Sorry, can I ask folks who are not speaking to mute, please? Thank you.
I'm sorry, it was my understanding that we were here to discuss any questions, and my input was to talk about what the special town meeting was about. If I have that wrong, let me know.
No, sorry, Ira. I heard someone else who was not muted and interrupting you.
Oh, okay.
So, excuse me.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ira. I want you to continue. I just thought.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know. It sounded like there was a difference of opinion there.
Oh, no. Pardon me. No, please continue.
Oh, okay. So studies have been done, and the Water Department and the Water Advisory Committee, perhaps, people who aren't familiar with how water decisions are made, the select board are the water commissioners of the town, and they make most of the decisions, but they have the Water Advisory Management Committee, of which David Hearn is a member. And they work with the Water Department to explore issues and how to best get the water out of the ground and to distribute it. And again, this is all detailed, and we dive into not just the finances, but try and understand what the real issues are to this topic. Obviously, PFAS was a major issue, and we had to correct it as a town. So once that was done with the temporary, we actually purchased instead of leasing the facility because we found that was more advantageous financially. And as PFAS problem became more of a problem, more of an issue in some of our other wells, we decided to expand the project, and it made sense to the water department and the water advisory committee to combine the water from 3 wells to 1 treatment plant. And that's sort of where we are. And that was the model that was put together, and the financial analysis, as well as the needs of the town, how much water coming out of which wells, and to serve the needs of the town now and into the future. And that was what appears in the warrant and the recommendation, a lot of links to the studies that were done. And in our exploration, we hit upon this, MWRA possibility of a solution. And this isn't new. This is something that had been examined in the past. And maybe David has some of the timeline, but we wanted to revisit that, and it was revisited. And therefore, we did the analysis between the purchase of waters from MWRA versus doing our own water treatment plant. And the recommendations that we came up with, along with the advisory committee and the select board, was that it was about a $19.7 million difference to go to the MWRA as opposed to doing our own water treatment. We wanted to make sure that we had water, and we had safe water, and could treat it. So that's really where this evolved. The only other thing I'll say, because I think this has come up, there was a connection made, and we do have a connection to MWRA, and we call that an emergency connection. And that's in the event there's any issue in the town of Sharon in an emergency where we don't have enough water supply, we have a connection through the town of Norwood to access that water. So we would have water until we fixed whatever the emergency was. So there is that connection. However, and maybe Mr. Estes Smargiassi can go into any necessary details about the difference between the emergency connection and a real connection, a full-time connection. It wasn't possible for us to just use that connection to hook up to the MWRA. And a lot of the cost is to build this piping network to get from a connection that exists in a neighboring town that is getting water from MWRA to Sharon. So that's the other issue of the cost, and why that cost is more, a fair amount more than just creating our own water treatment plant here in Sharon. And the only last thing I'll say while I have the floor is that some of our neighbors have run into a similar situation. Town of Easton, town of Mansfield, I think they also explored, and they are doing water treatment plants within their own towns as well. So that's a little bit of history, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Ira, thank you for jumping in and providing that clarification. For the sake of our panel and the questions that we submitted ahead of time, I'd like to kind of return to those. If some of them feel a little bit like we've covered it, then you guys can let me know. Right now, it looks like we have a little bit of a comparison between the staff at MWRA versus our town staff. There's a question here, Stephen, about the MWRA and water bans. Could you make a comment about what does the MWRA regularly have water bans during the summer months?
The MWRA does not. I can't speak for how, if a community joined, what conditions the other state regulatory bodies would have. But if you look back at the 2 most recent droughts, our water system stayed in its normal operating range. We encouraged, but did not require any conservation. I would say, though, that as communities have been joining our regional system, the Water Resource Commission has, in some cases, required some type of summer water use restrictions. I wouldn't call them water bans, but restrictions of some sort as part of their separate regulatory mandate on those towns. So because Boston, the communities we serve already aren't having water bans, but we wouldn't be able to promise that a new community joining wouldn't have a ban. What we can promise is that it wouldn't be because we were running out of water or in a drought situation, the water would still be there. Going back to the question of the emergency connection, I think it is great that Sharon has the ability, as a sort of backup supply through Norwood. The principal difference between a member status and emergency is that in order to use the emergency connection, the community needs to have DEP declare a water emergency. They typically require basically, very stringent water use restrictions on that. And I'm not knowing exactly what arrangements you made with Norwood, there may also be restrictions depending on the time of year on how much supply they could move across their system to that emergency pump station. But kudos to the town for having that. Having a redundant way of getting water is important. It's something we've invested a lot in being able to move water from our treatment facility to all the nooks and crannies of the system, continuing to invest in it because people do expect reliable supply. And it's good that you've gotten that built already.
Thank you, Stephen. And just to continue a little bit with questions about staffing and what MWRA has in place and planned for redundancy in the system.
So, so for those who redundancy sounds like a bad word. We always like to start with what do we mean by that? I like to think of it as an alternative pathway. So our goal in moving water from the reservoirs through our treatment plant and down in the metropolitan area is to have, at least two pathways for the water, enabling us to do maintenance, rehabilitation, inspection, all of those things. So we have two pathways from the reservoir to our treatment plant, two major conduits from our treatment plant into the Route 120 area. We're in the planning process right now, about to go out to design reasonably soon for parallel tunnels in the metropolitan area. We call that the Metropolitan Tunnel Project. And we've also been building parallel pipelines in a number of locations. We, in fact, just finished a few years ago parallel pipes down from the sort of core of the Boston system down towards Canton and Norwood so that we have the ability to supply them with one of those pipes out of service. So that's been our typical approach throughout the region, is to have that sort of reliable supply, able to do maintenance, able to do inspection and repairs, and still have the water flow under normal pressure and quantity.
Thank you, Stephen. And right next to this question is to David. David, could you explain for our folks what Sharon has in place for redundancy in our current system?
Our redundancy is more source specific. Ira mentioned and Steve just mentioned, obviously, the emergency connection again to MWRA. So that gives us source protection. We have multiple wells right now, even though some of them are challenged with PFAS, all of them are not. So, historically, we always thought if one well were to become severely contaminated, we go to other wells. In terms of our piping infrastructure, it's nothing as elaborate as the MWRA. There is, if I'm remembering the town pipe map, there is a large diameter pipe network closer to the center of town with legs going out to the outer reaches of the community. But those are really our redundant plan is source, not piping per se, if that makes sense.
And I would add, redundancy is more important in the wholesale system than it is within the retail community network. The community network's in sort of a grid. So if you close off a piece of pipe on one street, you're not serving the people on that street, but all the surrounding streets are served. In the regional wholesale system, losing a major, a 6-foot or a 10-foot diameter pipeline would put a large portion of the region out. So that's why we have parallel pipelines, somewhat different condition to serve the same purpose.
Steve, while you're on this topic of you're teaching us so much about your job. It's a very interesting one, actually, to understand how you're advising communities. And it's a question about the financial and technical assistance that MWRA provides to your member communities, such as staying ahead of new water quality regulations and removing lead water pipes. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The way in which we think about the institutional arrangement of MWRA in our communities is essentially a partnership. And so as a partnership, we can offer ways in which we can do things efficiently and effectively. So for instance, in terms of sort of thinking about future regulations and some of the technical issues, one of the benefits of the large regional wholesale system is we can have people dedicated to thinking about those issues, a water quality expert, as opposed to someone who has to be a water quality expert and a pipe expert and in a smaller community, you need to wear many hats. We can afford to have someone who can spend the extra hours on a particular topic. The other aspect of partnership is providing the kind of services at a regional level which help communities out. And I'll offer a couple of examples. So one is financial. We do provide zero interest loans to our communities to help them deal with infrastructure and water quality issues. So that's money that comes from our customers, but it facilitates communities being able to make investments, say in removing an old unlined cast iron main or repairing a water storage tank to improve water quality. We also provide financial assistance for removal of lead service lines, same basic idea. And we provide a number of technical issues. When a community has a water quality problem, our staff are available to help. One of the benefits of the larger staff is we can sort of jump in and assist. We also provide leak detection, technical assistance. Our laboratories are available for water quality testing included in the price of the water. So if Sharon or another community joins the MWRA, some of the costs for water quality testing that they might be doing now would be borne by the MWRA as a whole. Part of our sort of laboratory consort helps us understand what's going on locally and helps the community because you've got that backup. So there's a variety of issues where being part of the larger region offers the benefit of technical assistance, financial assistance, and just the ability to call upon additional resources. We have if there's a need for an emergency pump, we've got emergency pumps. If there's a need for a crew to help out, we'll often, if there's a major main break in a town, our crews are often available to provide that sort of backup assistance. It's nice being in a partnership, essentially.
Veronica, could I just ask a question to Stephen?
Of course. Go ahead, Ira.
Yeah, Stephen. So maybe I missed it, but is there any 0% loan available to hook up to MWRA? Some of the infrastructure, my understanding was that was not. That was one of the stumbling blocks that we ran into.
It's something we've thought about. I don't know that we're currently in a position to say that the existing, typically what happens when someone joins, then they become part of that funding for future water quality or other needs. So you might think of it as, you could think of it as, well, I may not get the zero interest loan for this piece, but I might have it available for something I need to do later. That's at least our current structure. One of my colleagues is on if she cares to offer any additional current, Colleen, if there's anything else you'd want to add on that, I'd be happy to have you jump in.
No, Steve, I think that covers it. We have not necessarily had the conversations about the zero interest loans on the kind of upfront cost for the infrastructure.
If I can put a pitch in for towns like Sharon who are in this situation, that would be that's really the biggest obstacle for us when we made this decision. One of them, and maybe the biggest, because that was the biggest cost difference between the water treatment plant here in Sharon was getting a 0% interest loan that the state offers from. So yeah, I would say if this is And it isn't just a Sharon issue. It's a state issue. It's a Commonwealth issue, and that seems to be something that you really might want to consider.
Yeah, and it's actually been an issue we've poked at with the state a little bit. They've offered zero interest loans for treatment, but not a zero interest loan for an alternative to treatment, which would make sense because if they solve the problem, they should be treated equally. It seems I don't know whether they haven't thought about it as creatively as that at this point, but they should. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a couple of questions here we'd like to pose to Mr. Ian Cook. Ian, Beaverbrook, where 3 of Sharon's municipal wells are located, is a tributary of the Neponset River, which is highly stressed in hot, dry summer weather when residents and businesses irrigate their lawns. Do you believe importing MWRA water help relieve drought-related stress by improving water flow in the river and hydrating riparian wetlands?
Short answer is yes, it would. Over the last few years, the state of Massachusetts has gone through a elaborate process around what's called its Water Management Act permitting process, which is where the state evaluates environmental impacts associated with water withdrawals. And in Sharon, most of your water is being withdrawn from the area near Well 4, near Beaverbrook, and distributed to other parts of town. So unlike communities that have sewer systems, it's a good thing that some of that water is being recycled back into the ground. But in general, it's being recycled back into the ground so far away from where it came out of the ground that it doesn't really do any good for Beaverbrook, and effectively it's gone. So DEP has developed a science-based system to evaluate and categorize the level of impact associated with a given water withdrawal based on 5 categories called groundwater categories 1 through 5 that have been correlated with the impact of water withdrawals on the presence and biological integrity of streams and native fish communities. And the Beaverbrook withdrawals are in the most severely impaired category, in groundwater category 5. The definition of groundwater category 5 is, without getting too far into the weeds of how this works, the definition of groundwater category 5 is any stream which is 55% or more depleted relative to its August flow. And here on Beaverbrook, it's actually 200% depleted. Even when you account for water returns, it's 178% depleted. It's actually either the most or one of the most depleted streams anywhere in the Neponset watershed. And site-specific study has found, sort of backed up that modeled data. Both sampling by DEP has shown that there's great habitat in place for native fish in Beaverbrook, but they just aren't there. And DNA-based sampling that our own organization have done shows the same thing below the wells, although there are some native fish upstream of the wells still. So in short, there is a pretty significant environmental impact that is not accounted for in most of the analysis here. And really, because Sharon's withdrawal from Beaverbrook is so large relative to such a small brook, really there's no way to reduce that impact to a reasonable level without finding water from a source with a lower environmental impact. And the main alternative for that would be water imported from the Mass Water Resources Authority. The one final thing I would say is, from an environmental standpoint, the problem is mostly in the summer. So it really isn't a year-round problem. If you could import some water to kind of take the pressure off in the summer, that might solve most of the environmental problem. The trouble is, from an infrastructure standpoint, then you're essentially building the treatment plants and building the MWRA connection. So it sort of creates the most expensive possible solution, which is generally not going to be appealing to most communities.
Ian, I see that David has his hand up. David, go ahead.
Thank you. so I'm going to get into dangerous waters here, and Ian is far more of an expert in these areas than I am. The standards that he's talking about, I refer to as the SWMI standards. Am I right with that, Ian? Okay, so that's the only way I can remember them. I'm sorry. So when this report came out 6-7 years ago, ballpark, is that about right, Ian? I think in that range, give or take. We haven't discussed this at the water management level in quite some time, but at the time we were led to believe that if we, that you have to remember that Sharon is the top of a hill. We get our water from rain. It hits the hills, it drains into the streams, some of it goes into the ground, and it all heads out of town in 3 or 4 different directions, if not 5, possibly from memory. So the report that we read, or that I don't want to say I read it, but the way it was presented to the committee implied that in the summertime, to Ian's point, that's when things are most stressed. In the summertime, regardless of any withdrawals whatsoever, anywhere in town, just based on rain falling from the sky and assuming it all gets into a stream, we would still be in category 5. That's what we were told at the time. And Ian's looking askance, and I'm not, by no means I'm not professing to be absolutely correct here. So this is not a battle of the facts. I'm just unclear as to what the facts are. But that's what I was led to believe. The other thing that has come up time and time again relative to pumping withdrawal and impact on stream flow is the expression Freetown muck. And again, at a very non-geological level of understanding, my understanding is that there's a separation between groundwater and stream flow, that our wells go below and level that is called Freetown muck. And there's actually a separation between what we pump and its immediate impact on stream flow. I'm not saying the impact is 0. I'm not saying that pumping has nothing to do with stream flow, but I am trying to get across the point that underground water and its withdrawal is not always directly related to surface level stream flows. I'm not saying it's not related, but it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 correlation. Does that make fair points, Ian, or feel free to shred me?
Sure, I think you raised a lot of points there. I'm not sure, certainly in terms of DEP's groundwater category system, you are in category 5, and if there were no water withdrawals, you'd be in category 1, which was the good category. There is another assessment that DEP looks at, which is really about the amount of impervious surface in a watershed as opposed to water withdrawals. And Sharon is definitely impacted by impervious surface. That is arguably, though, a problem that can be solved separately from the water withdrawal problem. So it's not like we simply say, we wash our hands of this, we can withdraw as much water as we want with a clear conscience, because we also haven't fixed that stormwater problem. In terms of the hydrology and the model and the level of depletion and whether the well somehow can withdraw water without affecting stream flow, it's true that groundwater hydrology is complicated. There often are peat layers or muck layers that influence the way water flows in unexpected ways. But with the hydrology we have in New England, there's not, we're not like the West where we can be mining ancient groundwater that, accumulated tens of thousands of years ago. This is all happening within 50, 60, 100 feet of the surface. And it's basically water moving through sand and other materials. And basically, there's no free lunch when it comes to hydrology. There may be a time lag associated with, if I pump 2 gallons today, maybe that doesn't affect stream flow for, a month or a day. But, water can't really be in 2 places at once. So at the end of the day, the details matter, but a water withdrawal is pretty much always going to affect stream health. And basically the way the state went about figuring that out was looking at where there are fish, and the fishing data sort of doesn't lie, that, the places that we have water withdrawals, we don't have those native fish. So.
Thank you, Ian. There's a related question here, and there's a couple of questions also in the chat, but I'd like to, just before I go to those, this could be what we were talking about in terms of that muck. And again, I'm a novice, but the question is that tons of organic matter from Sharon's Atlantic white cedar swamp have been converted into carbon dioxide as a result of desiccation. The question is, would switching from well pumping to importing MWRA water help arrest that process by slowing the loss of water from the swamp?
I have to confess, I am not an expert on the cedar swamp, although it is, an extraordinarily rare and valuable resource. It's clear to me from the studies I've looked at over the years that water is flowing from the swamp towards the lake, towards the wells, maybe in some other directions as well. And that the deterioration of the swamp that's happened over the years is definitely deleterious to Sharon's overall water system. I'm not sure that I can say one way or another whether the pumping is actually accelerating that process, or if it's more that the deterioration of the swamp is more impacting the water available for pumping. So unfortunately, I'm not really in a position to give a definitive answer to that question.
Thank you. I want to go to a question that's in the chat, and this could be to you, Ian. Can you or someone else address the relationship between the town's groundwater, drinking water, and the surface water, lake water? The understanding is that both are fed by the Great Cedar Swamp, so the levels might be interrelated.
Sure. Again, this gets back to my imperfect understanding of the dynamics of the swamp. I mean, my understanding is water is certainly moving from the swamp towards the wells, and it's also moving towards the lake. Whether the wells are actually sort of actively pulling water out of the swamp that is maybe pulling water away from the lake I just don't feel like I'm qualified to actually answer that question.
Thank you. There's one that's connected, though, and I think this would be interesting to folks. I'm not sure which on our panel could address it. But if the MWRA use would result in increased water entering the lake via springs, would the increased flow rate through the flume house help clear excess nutrients and potentially reduce the risk of cyanobacteria blooms in the lake? Does anybody want to touch that? Because that's something that all of us are affected by all summer long.
I guess I would volunteer. I mean, certainly, more clean water flowing into the lake is certainly going to benefit the lake and help keep it turning over, especially as we go through climate change and have more drought that's going to be causing more evaporation. I would think, again, because I can't definitively answer the question about the swamp and whether the water withdrawal is affecting the swamp and therefore reducing flow into the lake, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. The one thing I would say is that right now, Sharon is essentially removing a lot of water from the point right near Beaver Brook and distributing it all around town. And even if the town were to start using MWRA water, the amount of water it would be distributing around town would be about the same. And what would really happen is you would have more water remaining in Beaver Brook because you wouldn't be removing it there. But again, I can't say with any certainty whether that would actually affect the water flow through the lake or not. Certainly restoring the swamp would benefit everybody.
Thank you, Ian. This is another question for Steve. Steve, a community member is mentioning here in the chat that there used to be a provision that towns joining MWRA have to agree to accept landfill if needed, and wondered if that was still the case. And then in a related question, how are costs shared if planned or unplanned expenses arise, such as dam repairs, central distribution, pipe repairs, etc.? and that concern there, have those issues been resolved? Oh, I'm
So-
sorry. Let's start with those two.
Oh, that's those two. So I'm not aware of our having had anything that said water communities, people joining the water system have to take, at some point in the past had that rule, but we certainly don't have that rule now. So those are unrelated topics. The way in which MWRA's billing structure works is that we allocate our costs to communities based on their share of the total water use. So a community that used 10% of the water pays 10% of the bills. That's pretty straightforward. As a large regional utility, we maintain reserves for unexpected expenses. So it's one of the benefits of having a large resource that you're dealing with, where we plan for inspection and maintenance and capital improvements on an annual and on a 10-year basis as part of our capital budget. And we are, the finances are resilient enough that we've, I think, only once in our history needed to do a mid-year adjustment to rates. And that was when the Commonwealth actually took away money that they were planning on providing to us. So it wasn't because we had an unexpected expense, but a reduction in the revenues we received from the Commonwealth. So it's I would say, a benefit of a large, resilient financial body to be able to handle unexpected expenses.
Thank you. Ira, you did a good job of explaining the process by which FinCom and the town went through the determination of this recommendation in the warrant to approve Article 1, which would authorize the town to borrow additional funds to build this filtration system. And I'd love to address a question to David Hearn. David, could you explain that whether the proposed filtration system would filter out all the contaminants, and how would the plant operator know when the filtration media needs to be changed, and what happens if that plant operator is sick or on vacation? So we build this plant, and just in terms of its staffing and its operation, can you comment on that for us?
Not a licensed plant operator, but I'll give it a try. So I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question? I wanted to take it in order.
Yeah, simply that would the filtration system proposed filter out all the contaminants?
So the whatever filtration plant we have in place is going to be responsible for filtering out all regulated components. I don't, it's possible that, if you're running water through a green sand or granulated carbon or something, it's filtering out additional things beyond your target chemical that or pathogen that you're trying to remove or treat for. But as a water department, we're not going to say, oh, we're going to filter out Eliquis that gets into the groundwater or something like that. It's, we're going to be responsible for whatever federal and state regulations we're responsible for, and would treat water accordingly. I hope that answers that part of the question. The second part of the question, how would we know when a filter media needs to be replaced? I assume that, like any filtration system, there's an analysis of what's going in, there's an analysis of what's going out. Those are taken on a regular basis. At some point, the window between those two gets very narrow, and your media is failing and needs to be replaced, or some such system. It's just a filter. It's not going to be too dissimilar from a vacuum cleaner that over time you can sense the bag filling up with dust. You have to replace the bag. The question is how intelligently you sense what's actually happening within the media and your water. And lastly, it was a question about vacation scheduling. Is that what I'm remembering?
Just simply in terms of the staff of the facility and just wanting to make sure that we had backup for making sure that it was monitored properly. I think
covered
is
for
the point of the question.
vacations. So yeah, I mean, any organization, whether it's MWRA or Sharon Water Department. I mean, I went shopping at Costco this morning and, expected it to be crazy, but they had lots of checkout people. So literally no line at Costco when I got there this morning, because they were prepared for, 2 days of shopping before Thanksgiving. I would hope the Sharon Water Department would have the same approach to management, and plan for that. But it's another form of redundancy, I guess. You build in layers of expertise within your organization. You have backup just in case of sickness, vacations, whatever it is. But that's the responsibility of any well-managed organization. The Sharon Water Department receives award upon award at the state level for excellent management systems and whatnot. So I think does that answer the question sufficiently? I think, yeah.
To the best that you could. Thank you, David.
Yeah. Thank you.
Based on what I'm looking at in the chat, it seems like we have one question left, and it is either for you, David, or Ira. This community member has commented that this week the Conservation Commission asked for more information on costs of spreading the proposed treatment plant across several wells to lessen impact on the river and abutters near the proposed lower cost site. The concern is that this may, therefore what may be approved in its cost may not be clear by town meeting. And it did mention in the warrant, if I read it, and I'm recalling, that the warrant was printed prior to maybe some of this information being available, and that was clear in the warrant. Can either one of you assess how the cost benefit varies if the costs of local treatment increase from what is in the warrant? That's a question.
I can start, and David certainly chime in for any additional information. Unfortunately, the Conservation Commission did not make a decision, and the next meeting is not till after town meeting, December 7th. So we won't have that information, I don't believe, although the water department, I believe, is trying to put together those figures, but the initial feeling is it would not be a cost savings. But the only thing I want to repeat again, the urgency of the lost opportunity cost of a 0% loan and some of the grant money that was specific to this particular proposal, this particular treatment plant, which we explored. I think the water department explored, and we may not be able to take advantage and switch the application around to accommodate a different scenario than what we already proposed. That said, as you can see, there's information that's being added to this weekly, daily. I'm saying we learn things all the time, new things, and we love having the input from the community members who are experts in their own fields and can add to the discussion. But I truly believe that the town has been diligent and done the best it could with the information that they sought and put the proposals together, gained some of the grant money and the application for the 0% loan. All that said, if there are other options that become more viable or more beneficial, I think we should pursue that information. And if it's important to make a change in stream, then we really consider that. But we need to move forward at this special town meeting. That's the purpose of this special town meeting. Whether it becomes separate facilities at individual wells or re-examining the costs of joining MWRA, we really need to make a decision to supplement the funding that we started in 22 town meeting in order to move this forward, or we really may do some harm to the position that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, if I could follow up, the decision to join MWRA or to build a water treatment plant aren't intrinsically linked, and by that I mean you don't have to shut off funding for the water treatment plant to pursue joining the MWRA. If you do shut off funding for the water treatment plant, your water future becomes very insecure very quickly, and that is something that I think would be unhealthy in the worst sense of the word, but foolhardy for the community to do at this point. If the water treatment, this resolution at town, or this warrant at town meeting has to pass, and the way Sharon works historically is, lots of money borrowings can be authorized. I'm sorry to battle there, but borrowings are authorized. It doesn't mean the money is spent. We could authorize $50 million for this treatment plant or for connection to MWRA and spend 10 million of it. So the idea that we commit to the borrowing does not by definition say we are committing to a project. If many people listening are proponents of joining MWRA, I strongly advise that they lobby the select board. Again, Ira mentioned they are the water commissioners in town. It's not the Water Management Advisory Committee, but either way, there is time to make decisions about Sharon's future that could go in another direction, whether it's another location for the treatment plant, whether it's treatment plant at its currently proposed site, whether it's MWRA. Those options remain available even if the borrowing is authorized. So I would say the town needs to authorize this borrowing. It's extremely important. I hope that makes sense. It's just, I guess if I could give a quick comparison here, one thing we haven't talked about, Steve gave an answer about the intermunicipal agreements to join, connect through the MWRA. Many years ago, long before we had our current emergency connection through the town of Norwood to MWRA, there was an effort at the water management level, interdepartmental level, to make a connection to the MWRA through the town of Stoughton. And there were some infrastructure advantages to going through Stoughton instead of Norwood, elevations and whatnot. It would have been probably slightly more cost effective to do that, not drastically, but money's money.
In progress.
It took years of failed negotiations back and forth with the town of Stoughton, lots of project uncertainties. And finally, water management said, we need to go in another direction. It's too uncertain. We need to have some water security in terms of redundancy. Let's go to Norwood. And the project with Norwood was worked out very quickly, very smoothly, at a reasonable cost. Joining the MWRA could turn into trying to get an emergency connection through Stoughton. There are a lot of politics involved. There are the intermunicipal agreements. There is a massive infrastructure project with unknown costs associated with it. As of today, those costs are estimated to be about the same as the water treatment plant. It's a big, complicated project. I have no faith in those numbers whatsoever. I'm not a person that puts a lot of faith in construction numbers in general, but we are approaching 90% design for the water treatment plant. So those numbers are they're becoming more clear. And the dollars associated with the MWRA connection are actually becoming less clear. And I'm really sorry to be saying that, but that's the reality that I see today. But please, I hope listeners don't see not supporting, I'm using double negatives here, so I hope I'm making sense, but this warrant article has to be supported. A no vote on this warrant is not the way to get to an MWRA membership. It would just be foolish for Sharon's water security, and I just can't recommend that.
David, as a person who comes to this, as I said at the outset, without a lot of information to go on, that final conversation is very helpful to me as a community member and a taxpayer to understand that this decision is about an opportunity for borrowing, for the potential to do this project that we have committed to with filtration, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're spending the money. We're just authorizing the borrowing of it, and it leaves open choices to connect with MWRA in the future, should we so choose. That was very helpful to me. As has been all of the input from all of our panelists tonight. I really, really appreciate the expertise of everyone and their time and the opportunity for this community to hear from you, because for me, it has really helped me understand the issue more deeply. I want to call folks' attention that there is the good report on the Great Cedar Swamp on the Conservation Commission's website that was added to the chat. I think that we are getting to the end of our time. We've been at this for over an hour. Cheryl, thank you so much. I wonder if there's anything from your perspective that we've left out, or do you feel like we've managed to cover a lot of ground, and maybe that's a good end on it?
Yeah, Veronica, you did a tremendous job trying to keep track of the chat and talking with each of our panelists. So we thank you so much. And to those who still have remaining questions, feel free to ask town officials. Sustainable Sharon Coalition, we're made up of 100% volunteers. And so we don't have the definitive word either. We just had this program because we wanted to educate our community about this important topic, and you all did a wonderful job with that. So thank you. A round of applause for Veronica and the panelists. We really appreciate your expertise and your willingness to be here. If
Cheryl, can I just put in a plug that there is another opportunity before town meeting, actually. There's an open warrant meeting of the Finance Committee next Monday night. And of course, the special town meeting is on Thursday, not Monday, because of the holiday schedule. So we can continue any conversation. And I really want to thank you, Sustainable Sharon, for hosting this, because it's really through these conversations that we get to educate ourselves so that we can make reasonable recommendations to town meeting.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you added that. I was going to add, although if someone has a question that they felt like they couldn't get answered today, feel free to email support@sustainablesharon.org. And we do monitor that, and we'll forward it to the appropriate person to answer. Thank you all again, and thank you to Sharon Community TV for being here, and we will see you all at the next meeting. Take care.
Thank you.